In the late 19th century, London was the largest city in the world, a center of industrial advancement, trade, science, and culture. Its skyline was dominated by factories and warehouses, while its streets bustled with carriages, pedestrians, and merchants. Yet behind the prosperity and the veneer of civilization lay an underworld of poverty, overcrowding, disease, and crime. Nowhere was this contrast more pronounced than in the East End, particularly in the district of Whitechapel, which had become synonymous with overcrowding, squalor, and social vulnerability. Narrow alleyways, densely packed tenements, and poorly maintained streets provided the perfect environment for criminal activity and for the kind of predatory violence that would shock the city in 1888. It was here, amidst the fog, filth, and desperate struggle for survival, that a series of murders began, later attributed to a figure who would become infamous worldwide under the name Jack the Ripper. The first known victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was found on the morning of August 31st, 1888, lying on Bucks Row. She was approximately 43 years old, and like many women in Whitechapel, she had been driven into prostitution by extreme poverty and personal misfortune. Nichols's body displayed mutilations that were both deliberate and precise. Her throat had been cut from left to right, severing major blood vessels, and her lower abdomen had been slashed in a manner suggesting familiarity with the human anatomy. The gruesomeness of the crime, coupled with the technical skill apparent in the injuries, indicated that the killer was not acting out of uncontrolled rage, but with cold, methodical intent. The circumstances of her death and her social vulnerability made her an easy target in a city where the East End was largely ignored by the authorities and the upper classes. Only a month later, on September 30th, two more victims were discovered: Annie Chapman and Elizabeth Stride. Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her body bore the same hallmarks of mutilation seen in Nichols, with her throat cut deeply and her abdomen slashed in precise incisions. The precision of these attacks suggested knowledge of anatomy and familiarity with the human body, which would become a defining feature of the killings attributed to the Ripper. Elizabeth Stride, found in Dutfield's yard, was killed on the same day, but her murder appeared incomplete. Her throat had been cut, but her body lacked the extensive mutilations seen in Chapman and Nichols. Some historians theorize that the killer may have been interrupted, possibly by a passerby, forcing him to abandon his intended ritualistic mutilation. These murders established a pattern that would define the canonical 5 victims and provide the first evidence that a single individual may have been responsible for the East End killings. On November 9th, the violence escalated with the murder of Catherine Eddowes, whose body was discovered in Mitre Square in the City of London. Eddowes's throat had been slashed, and her body exhibited extensive mutilations, including the removal of organs. Later the same night, Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest and final canonical victim, was killed in her own room on Miller's Court. Unlike the previous victims, Kelly was murdered indoors, allowing the killer the time and privacy to commit perhaps the most gruesome act of all. Her body was extensively dismembered, with nearly all of her internal organs removed and displayed with shocking precision. The extreme nature of Kelly's murder suggested that the killer had escalated his methods and that the attack was not merely an opportunistic act, but a deliberate, highly organized crime. All 5 canonical victims shared common characteristics. They were women engaged in prostitution, living in the impoverished East End, and socially marginalized. Their work made them vulnerable, and their deaths occurred in areas where the police presence was minimal and where local residents often avoided involvement due to fear. Social historians have emphasized that the victim's vulnerability was not coincidental. It was a factor in the selection process of the killer, who targeted women whose disappearances would initially attract little attention, yet whose deaths would provoke widespread fear. The Metropolitan Police, and particularly Scotland Yard, faced extraordinary challenges in the investigation. Officers patrolled the streets, conducted interrogations, and examined crime scenes, but they were hampered by the limitations of contemporary forensic science. Fingerprinting was in its infancy. There were no reliable methods for tracking blood. Evidence and the concept of criminal profiling had not yet been developed. Witnesses were often unreliable or fearful, and the labyrinthine streets of Whitechapel provided endless opportunities for the killer to evade capture. The East End itself, densely populated and impoverished, was resistant to scrutiny, and police efforts were further complicated by the sheer volume of crime in the district, ranging from petty theft to violent assault, which made prioritization difficult. The role of the press in shaping public perception cannot be overstated. Newspapers such as The Times, The Star, and the Illustrated Police News reported the murders with sensationalist detail, publishing accounts of mutilations, speculative motives, and lurid narratives that captivated readers across London and the country. Letters allegedly written by the murderer, including the notorious Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter, were sent to news offices and to Scotland Yard. These letters claimed responsibility for the crimes, taunted authorities, and demonstrated knowledge of crime scenes that suggested the sender might indeed be the killer, though the authenticity of the letters remains disputed. Nonetheless, these communications played a critical role in amplifying the sense of terror and creating the legend of Jack the Ripper in the public imagination. The social response to the killings reflected the sharp contrasts of Victorian London. Residents of affluent districts viewed the murders as distant curiosities, while East End inhabitants lived in fear. Women were warned not to walk alone at night, and families kept children under close supervision. The fear that gripped Whitechapel extended beyond immediate safety concerns. It reflected deeper anxieties about social decay, urban overcrowding, and the inability of authorities to protect the most vulnerable. Public meetings, letters to local officials, and community organizing emerged as ways for residents to cope with the growing panic, though these efforts were largely insufficient to deter the killer. Investigative methods of the time were primitive by modern standards. Officers relied on witness statements, neighborhood patrols, and rudimentary examinations of crime scenes. There were no systematic methods for preserving forensic evidence, and the concept of criminal profiling had not yet been introduced. The methodical precision of the attacks, particularly the anatomical mutilations, led some contemporary experts to speculate that the killer had surgical experience or had worked in a medical setting. However, despite extensive questioning of doctors, surgeons, and local residents, no concrete suspect emerged. Over the months that followed, the atmosphere in Whitechapel remained tense and oppressive. The murders dominated public consciousness, influencing literature, theatre, and political discourse. The authorities, pressured by newspapers and the public, implemented increased patrols, mounted public warnings, and attempted to engage the community in vigilance. But these measures were largely ineffective. Jack the Ripper's continued elusiveness contributed to his notoriety, as each unsolved murder heightened fear and fascination. The killings also illuminated broader social issues. Whitechapel was a district of extreme poverty, with overcrowded tenements, inadequate sanitation, and rampant unemployment. Disease, malnutrition, and crime were constant threats, and social services were minimal. These conditions created an environment in which predation and violence could occur with relative impunity. Victims of Jack the Ripper were not anomalies. They were part of a pattern of systemic vulnerability affecting women in particular, who had few options for economic survival outside of marginalized labor such as street prostitution. Jack the Ripper's murders became a defining moment in the history of criminal investigation. They revealed the limitations of law enforcement in densely populated, impoverished urban areas and exposed the challenges of dealing with a perpetrator who combined cunning, anatomical knowledge, and opportunism. The sensational reporting of the press ensured that the crimes reached far beyond the East End, shaping perceptions of the East End as a place of terror and vice, while also generating public discourse about social reform, policing, and urban poverty. Ultimately, the Whitechapel murders were not only acts of individual violence, but also reflections of a society struggling with rapid urbanization, industrial growth, and stark social inequality. Jack the Ripper became more than a criminal. He became a symbol of the anxieties, fears, and contradictions of Victorian London. The murders, their investigation, and the subsequent media frenzy created a narrative that continues to captivate historians, criminologists, and the public to this day. The East End of 1888 was thus defined not only by the brutal murders themselves, but by the social, economic, and institutional conditions that allowed a killer to operate with terrifying impunity, leaving a legacy of fear and fascination that endures more than a century later. Following the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper in 1888, the City of London remained gripped by fear, speculation, and uncertainty. Scotland Yard faced unprecedented pressure to apprehend a killer who appeared not only methodical and precise, but also seemingly invisible. The East End, already burdened by overcrowding, poverty, and disease, became a landscape of heightened vigilance. Yet, despite the increased police presence and widespread public alarm, the murderer was never captured. The investigation revealed both the limitations of contemporary law enforcement and the challenges of policing a complex, densely populated urban environment. One of the earliest documented investigative efforts involved extensive patrols of the East End, particularly Whitechapel, where the majority of victims had been found. Officers were deployed in large numbers to monitor streets, alleyways, and lodging houses. Scotland Yard issued posters requesting information from the public and instructed residents to report suspicious behavior. Despite these measures, the killer continued to act with impunity, suggesting not only careful planning, but also an intimate familiarity with the district. The complexity of Whitechapel's streets, combined with poor lighting and the transient nature of its population, provided significant advantages to an assailant who knew the area well. Investigators also sought to identify patterns in the selection of victims. The canonical five, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were all women engaged in prostitution and living in socially marginalized circumstances. Police theorized that the killer was likely familiar with the habits and routines of these women, possibly encountering them regularly in the course of his life. The method of attack, characterized by precise throat slashing and abdominal mutilation, suggested knowledge of human anatomy, which led some officers and medical experts to speculate that the perpetrator might have had surgical or butchery experience. However, despite extensive inquiries among local surgeons, doctors, and butchers, no credible suspect emerged. The role of eyewitness accounts was critical but limited by the conditions of the time. The streets of Whitechapel were crowded, poorly lit, and chaotic, making it difficult to obtain reliable testimony. Some witnesses reported seeing a man leaving the scenes of certain murders, but descriptions were often inconsistent and contradictory. One of the most famous eyewitness accounts involved a man seen near Mitre Square shortly after the murder of Catherine Eddowes. The witness described a figure wearing a dark coat and a hat, moving quickly and purposefully. Despite these reports, no one could definitively link any individual to the crimes. The press played an unparalleled role in shaping public perception and increasing the notoriety of the murders. Newspapers competed to publish the most sensational accounts, often embellishing details of mutilations and the killer's presumed motives. Letters allegedly written by the murderer, including the notorious "Dear Boss" letter, in which the name Jack the Ripper first appeared, and the "From Hell" letter delivered to George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, fueled public fascination and fear. The authenticity of these letters remains debated by historians, but their effect on the city was undeniable. They contributed to the perception that the killer was not only ruthless, but also deliberately taunting the authorities, heightening the sense of dread and helplessness among Londoners. Several theories emerged regarding the identity of Jack the Ripper, ranging from the plausible to the speculative. Contemporary investigations focused on local residents, recently arrived immigrants, and individuals with medical or butchery experience. The German immigrant community, which had a significant presence in Whitechapel, was scrutinized, reflecting widespread xenophobic attitudes. However, no conclusive evidence linked any particular ethnic group or resident to the murders. The idea that the killer might be someone familiar with both Whitechapel and surgical procedures guided much of the investigation, but despite examining dozens of suspects, police never found definitive proof. Over the years, various individuals have been proposed as potential suspects. Among the most cited is James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant whose diary, discovered in the 1990s, allegedly contained a confession to the Ripper murders. However, extensive analysis has cast doubt on the diary's authenticity, leaving the claim unverified. Another suspect, Walter Sickert, a British painter, has been linked to the crimes through circumstantial evidence, including his interest in the murders and alleged coded references in his artwork. Yet there is no direct documentation connecting him to the killings. Some theories even extended to members of the British royal family, suggesting that the murders were attempts to conceal scandal, though historians widely dismiss these as speculative and lacking credible evidence. The social implications of the murders were profound. Whitechapel's population was already vulnerable due to overcrowding, unemployment, and inadequate sanitation. The Ripper's actions brought to light the consequences of neglecting urban poverty and the lack of social services. Women working as prostitutes were particularly exposed, and the murders intensified public concern about the treatment and safety of marginalized populations. Charitable organizations and community groups attempted to improve conditions in the East End, organizing shelters and outreach programs, yet the structural problems persisted, and the immediate fear of the Ripper remained palpable. The murders also had lasting effects on policing practices. Scotland Yard faced criticism for its inability to capture the killer, prompting debates about the need for professionalization, improved investigative techniques, and better coordination between police units. Some historians argue that the Ripper case indirectly influenced the development of modern forensic methods, including systematic crime scene investigation, evidence preservation, and criminal profiling. Although these innovations would emerge gradually, the limitations revealed during the 1888 investigations highlighted the challenges of policing a rapidly expanding and densely populated city. Public fascination with the murders continued long after the crimes ceased. The combination of extreme violence, anonymity of the perpetrator, and the sensational coverage created a cultural phenomenon that extended far beyond the East End. Literature, plays, and later films drew upon the narrative of Jack the Ripper, transforming him into a symbol of fear, chaos, and the unknown. Scholars have noted that the Ripper case reflects broader anxieties of Victorian society, including concerns about urbanization, the role of women, and the moral consequences of industrialization. The killings were not isolated incidents, but were emblematic of deeper societal tensions, including class inequality, urban squalor, and the limits of authority in maintaining public safety. Letters and documents associated with the case continued to intrigue investigators and historians. Some contained detailed knowledge of the crime scenes, while others appeared to be hoaxes designed to provoke the public and the press. These writings contributed to a narrative in which the killer was intelligent, calculating, and manipulative, further intensifying the mythos surrounding Jack the Ripper. The interplay between documented fact, eyewitness testimony, and media sensationalism created a complex historical record that continues to challenge scholars and criminologists. Despite extensive investigations, the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown. The case exemplifies the difficulties of criminal investigation in an era before modern forensic science. It also underscores the vulnerability of marginalized communities in rapidly industrializing cities and the ways in which social neglect can facilitate criminal activity. The Ripper's legacy is both historical and symbolic. He is remembered not only as a brutal murderer, but also as a figure whose crimes reveal the failures, fears, and contradictions of Victorian London. Over a century later, the story of Jack the Ripper continues to captivate public imagination. Researchers have analyzed police records, contemporary newspapers, letters, and testimonies to reconstruct the events of 1888. The combination of meticulous documentation, social context, and human tragedy allows for a detailed understanding of the period, the victims, and the challenges faced by law enforcement. While speculation about suspects continues, the factual record provides a clear depiction of a city under siege, a society grappling with crime and poverty, and a criminal whose identity and motives remain a mystery. The canonical 5 murders of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly reveal not only the methodology of a killer, but also the conditions of the East End. Each victim's story sheds light on the intersection of gender, class, and vulnerability in Victorian London. Their deaths, while horrific, serve as historical evidence of systemic issues, including inadequate policing, insufficient social support, and the risks faced by women in marginalized positions. The Ripper's ability to strike repeatedly without apprehension highlights the limitations of contemporary society and the complexities of urban life in the late 19th century. Jack the Ripper's murders were ultimately a convergence of personal malice, social neglect, and historical circumstance. The killer exploited the vulnerabilities of his victims and the structural weaknesses of law enforcement. The meticulous documentation of each crime, coupled with the extensive media coverage, provides historians with a rich source of evidence to study the period. Whitechapel in 1888 remains an enduring case study in criminology, social history, and the impact of media on public perception. The murders catalyzed discussions about policing, urban poverty, and the treatment of women, and they left an indelible mark on the cultural imagination, inspiring literature, art, and scholarly inquiry for generations. Even today, more than a century later, the fascination with Jack the Ripper endures. The interplay of fact and legend, the meticulous detail of the murders, and the enduring mystery surrounding the killer's identity continue to captivate scholars, writers, and the public. The case stands as a testament to the complex dynamics of crime, society, and media in Victorian London. It reminds us of the vulnerabilities inherent in marginalized communities and the consequences of urban neglect. Jack the Ripper, though never apprehended, remains a symbol of terror, anonymity, and the dark side of human nature. While the victims' stories provide a sobering glimpse into the realities of life in the East End, the perils faced by women, and the societal forces that allowed such crimes to occur. The investigation, while unsuccessful in capturing the murderer, left behind an extraordinary record of meticulous documentation, from police reports and witness statements to newspaper articles and correspondence. These records allow modern readers and researchers to piece together the sequence of events, the lives of the victims, and the social context of Whitechapel. They also highlight the challenges faced by law enforcement in an era before fingerprint analysis, DNA profiling, and modern investigative procedures, demonstrating how much progress has been made in criminal justice since the 19th century. The Ripper's influence extended beyond immediate fear. The murders prompted social reform efforts, including initiatives aimed at improving housing, sanitation, and public health in Whitechapel. Charities, religious organizations, and community groups sought to address the underlying conditions that made residents vulnerable to crime and disease. While these efforts did not immediately prevent further violence, they contributed to long-term awareness of urban poverty and the need for social intervention. In the end, the story of Jack the Ripper is a convergence of historical fact, social analysis, and cultural narrative. The canonical murders, the responses of law enforcement, the media coverage, and the subsequent speculation create a complex, multifaceted portrait of Victorian London under duress. The legacy of these events continues to inform both academic research and popular imagination, ensuring that Jack the Ripper remains one of the most studied and discussed criminals in history. The murders provide a window into a society grappling with rapid urbanization, profound inequality, and the challenges of protecting vulnerable populations. Jack the Ripper, though never identified, represents the intersection of crime, society, and myth. His acts were brutal and deliberate, yet they also exposed the fragility of the systems meant to maintain order and protect citizens. The victims, often overlooked in their own time, have become central to our understanding of the East End, illustrating the human cost of poverty and social neglect. The case endures as a historical lesson, a cautionary tale, and a subject of unending fascination, bridging the gap between the horrors of the past and the enduring questions about justice, morality, and human nature.